Well, hello and welcome to another one of my screencast presentations. My name is Shardul, and in this video presentation, I'm excited to demonstrate the observer design pattern by coding it all up in plain vanilla JavaScript, or ECMAScript 5 if you will, against the DOM API. But before we jump into the IDE and start coding, here's a little bit of theory that you may find useful. Alright, so the observer pattern is a behavioral design pattern where we have an object and a bunch of objects that are aptly named subject and observers. These observers constantly keep observing the subject for a change of some state on that subject. So when the state changes, these observers would want to take some action. Maybe they want to have an update method where each of these observers would want to take some action. So in the absence of the observer pattern, each of these observers would have to resort to something known as polling. Polling is a very inefficient way where each of the observer object constantly keeps monitoring or polling the subject to see if the state has changed. But thanks to the observer pattern, now what we have is each of these observers will have to implement an iObserver interface. And what that does is that it will make sure that all of these observers will have an update method, and inside of these update method, each observer is free to have its own implementation. But the only requirement is that they need to have an update method. So what that will ensure is that whenever the subject changes its state, it is going to invoke the notify method, which is on the subject. This method is on the subject, and inside of this notify method, the subject is going to go over each of these observers. It actually maintains a list of these observers, and when the state changes, the subject is going to invoke notify, and inside the notify method, we go over each of these observers and execute the update method. So the requirement is that each of these observers will need to have an update method, and when the notify is invoked, the update on each of these observers gets invoked. So that was a theory of the observer pattern. Now let's jump into the IDE and start coding. All right, let's start by creating a new file. Call it observer.html. I'm going to use the Zen coding technique, so I'm just going to say HTML:5, hit the tab key. That gives me the HTML5 boilerplate. Zen coding again, the input of type attribute equals text, and ID of subject, hit the tab, that expands to input, line break, the observers, and then I'm going to use hash observer $*3, hit tab, gives me three divs with the IDs of observer 1 through observer 3, and I'm going to style each of these divs with a height of 40 pixels, width of 300 pixels, and a border that's 1 pixel wide, solid, and black in color, and also have a margin of 5 pixels. And let's see how that looks in the browser. I'm going to use Chrome. So what I have here is a text box and three divs, and I intend to make these three divs as the observer that observes the state change on the subject. All right, let's jump into our HTML and put the script. For this demonstration, I'm going to put the script directly in the HTML, and for the sake of brevity, uh, I'm not going to concentrate much on the UI, only functional aspects. I just intend to show how observer pattern could be implemented. So here's how I would like to organize my code. I'll first have an observer list collection object, a subject interface, an observer interface, a method that actually helps me stick all of the methods in the interface on the concrete object, and I'm going to use the function constructor to define a collection object called observer list. We'll have a property called observer list, which is an array, and to the prototype of this collection object, I'm going to add methods like add. I'm going to have 5 methods. Let's duplicate the code just so I could save some time. I'll have a count method, correct typo, a remove method, index of method, and also get obj method. So the add method takes in a parameter obj and then simply pushes it to the internal array. Count simply returns the length of the array. And remove would essentially splice out the index, which this method will have to take as a parameter index, and splice out one item from the array. Index of will have to give the index of the object it receives as the parameter. So I will have to use a for loop that goes from 0 to the length of the observer list. And if the observer at I equals observer list I equals the object, incoming object, then we found the index, just return the index back. In order to get the object at a specified index, we just need to return the item at that specified index. Now let's define the interface. Again, the function constructor iSubject. Like I said earlier, there are no interfaces in JavaScript. We need to simulate it in some way. So here's how I'm simulating it. It's not exactly an interface. Interface doesn't have to have it shouldn't have any state in it. It only needs to have method shells. However, I'm trying to simulate interface here in JavaScript. Make it have a method called addObserver, takes in the observer and sticks it inside of the observer's collection object by calling the add method on it. Likewise, it will also have the remove observer method. Observer, function observer. What I do is call the remove method on the observer's collection object, and also have to specify the index of the observer that I need to splice out. And the most important method, notify method, is what I'm going to have to define. That would go over all of the observers in the observer list collection and execute the update method. So I equals 0, I equals this.observers.count, I plus equals 1, this.observers.update, get obj, pardon me, I, and then I need to call the update method on them, each observer. Let's define the observer interface. Again, the function constructor. The only requirement for the interface is it needs to have a method called update. Takes in a parameter called value, and it's best defined in the concrete type, concrete observer. All right, let's define the method that actually sticks the methods on the interface to a concrete observer. Takes two parameters, the object and the second parameter is the methods on the method where in this case the interface, whose methods will have to be stuck on the first parameter. For k in extension, obj of k equals extension of k. So every key value pair which is in the extension object will now be on the object, obj object. Let's put all this code inside of the window.onload event handler. Extension. I'm going to directly use the IDs as if they were the DOM objects. One advantage of putting the JavaScript inside the same file as the HTML is I don't have to each time say document.getElement by ID in order to get the element, the DOM element. I could straight away start using the ID as if it were a DOM element. So I'm simply using subject observer1, observer2, observer3, calling the extension method, the extend method, to stick the methods on the interface onto the concrete types. And here on the add event listener of the subject, which is a text box, On the key up event, I'm calling the notify method on the subject, and I'm also adding the observer 1 through 3 as observers by calling in the add observer on the subject. Observer 2, observer 3. And I'm going to define the update method on each of these observers. Like I said, each observer is free to have its own implementation. Observer 1 will choose to have its inner HTML as the value that's been passed to it by the subject text box. Just simply replicating the code. Observer 2, observer 3, and after say 3 seconds, I'm going to remove observer 3 from the observer list. So after 3 seconds, observer 3 will no longer be an observer. Subject dot remove observer, observer 3. So for the sake of variety, the observer 2's update methods, I'm going to delay it by 500 milliseconds. So I'm going to have a window time set timeout, the function callback function, and 500. So basically, I'm going to make the inner HTML the same as a value, but after 500 milliseconds. And because it's inside the set timeout, I should use the observer 2, the explicit name of the object. Now let's see how that looks in the browser. So when I type, as you can see, the 3 divs are now observers. The second div has a delay of 500 milliseconds, and the third div has now stopped behaving like a observer because we chose to remove it as an observer. And that was a simple demonstration of the observer pattern using just the plain vanilla JavaScript against the DOM API. Thank you for watching, and if you like this presentation, I would encourage you to go ahead and subscribe to my channel, and please like, comment, and share. And see you guys again in my next video. Peace out.